One of my longtime rivals here on YouTube, who goes by the name Unnatural Vegan, the big reveal in her personal political philosophy was her discovery, her conviction, her unveiling of the fact that, and I'm quoting her verbatim here, her unveiling of the shocking fact that justice does not exist. I remember saying to a colleague of mine years ago, it's no more surprising to say that justice doesn't exist than it is to say the number 7 doesn't exist, or indeed the color red doesn't exist. Yes, justice is an abstract concept that human beings create. It's very subjective. It's very much a creature of cultural conditions and expectations and perceptions and misperceptions. But it's really just as laughably stupid to say justice does not exist as it is to say beauty does not exist, or indeed truth does not exist. Now, in certain very technical philosophical discussions, maybe we have to delve into the depths and the shallowness of this statement that truth itself does not exist. Rarely. We've just had another controversy in the American mainstream press about a black man being beaten to death by a group of police officers. To my knowledge, every single one of the police officers involved in this beating are themselves also black. They are African Americans. So this is being received by the American body politic in a very different way. And once again, the braying crowds, the unwashed masses are screaming out for justice. Now, part of why I'm making this video is that I really do not think justice is a difficult concept to understand. We've made it difficult for ourselves in the Western tradition because we have presumed to treat it as the first principle of government. A problem that can be laid at the feet of Plato. We're doing this in an unusual time zone today. Plato is the way we pronounce the name Plato in the United States and Canada. All right. Every so often, you guys can comment live here while I'm doing this. I get people complaining that I pronounce the name Plato like the children's toy Play-Doh. But that is the correct standard pronunciation of the name here in the United States and Canada. We don't say Plato. That pronunciation sounds hilarious to me, so I apologize if my pronunciation sounds hilarious to you. I do not genuinely blame Plato for this, but it's true that he's kind of left holding the bag. He's kind of stuck with the responsibility for it because of his treatment of justice, and then what people made of it in the centuries to follow. It's a reassuring myth that few of us question. Why does government exist? Justice. Right away, this brings us into a paradoxical worldview that only the government does justice, creates justice. That without government, there would be no justice. That that government has a monopoly on violence. That government has a monopoly on the decision between right and wrong, good and evil. Conveniently, we're basically taking the role that used to be occupied by the Catholic Church in the Dark Ages, and we are, in a very unexamined way, handing it over to government. The notion that government exists in order to do justice, or that it primarily and definitively exists to do justice, it's not the case in all times, or in all cultures, in all historical periods. There's no doubt that if you were to ask the question in the Chinese tradition, what is the first principle of government? Why does government exist? And for example, what is the difference between a government and a bunch of gangsters, a bunch of bandits, or a bunch of pirates who may live together on a little island or live together in a cave, and they may have laws and regulations and their own sense of justice and injustice? I think all of you would agree, still to this day, if it is justice that you want done, you might be better off paying the mafia rather than paying a lawyer. Rather than going to the court system for justice, you can go to organized crime for justice of a sort, right? There's justice that's measured out by gangs within the prisons. There's all different kinds of justice. There's justice that's done by your father and your mother. There is no government monopoly on justice. The government doesn't even have a monopoly on the knowledge of justice. What is just and what is unjust? Justice is done everywhere by anyone at all times, or nowhere by no one at any time. It's not a creature of government. If we were to pose the question to any classical Chinese scholar today, or we were to go back in time a few centuries, in the Chinese tradition, what is the first principle of government? What is it that makes government different from a bunch of gangsters or a bunch of pirates? And there have been periods of time when organized crime or pirates controlled a certain amount of land, when they really did have to take on some of the functions of a government. And there have been times when groups of gangsters and pirates conquered the capital city, took over government. This has happened all over the world, not just in China, so on and so forth. What is the difference between a coup d'etat and a revolution? So what is government from a Chinese perspective? It has nothing to do with justice. It has everything to do with right, spelled R-I-T-E, right and ritual. Okay, this is a very ancient conception of government, right? Who is the legitimate king? Who is the legitimate leader of the government? The person who performs certain rituals. I read an anthropological study about a particular tribe in Africa. And in this tribe, this is the sort of thing that you can imagine white Europeans like to make up fables about, but this was really the reality. Their tradition was that the leader of their tribe, the president or the king of their society, was the man who would have sex with each virgin female before she was married to another man, before she was married to the man she was betrothed to. He would deflower all of the virgins of the tribe. Now, the point of this anthropological study, believe it or not, was as follows. Europeans looked at this in a kind of lurid, pornographic way. They're just freaked out by how alien this conception of society is. The shaman in this tribe explained they were terrified of a curse, this group of people. They believed that the blood that was released when a woman lost her virginity, that this was a kind of curse, and that if a normal man were the first person to have sex with a certain female, he would himself be cursed, he would become sick, and he would die. Now, you can imagine there's always enough anecdotal evidence around of someone who had sex out of wedlock, like someone who had sex with a young woman who was a virgin without having these rituals performed, and then suddenly and inexplicably he got sick and died. There will always be anecdotal evidence around to support a totally pseudoscientific thesis. But these men participated in this, not feeling that they were oppressed by the shaman, but feeling that the shaman was doing them a service by releasing the curse, by making it safe for them to have sex with their own wives. All right. Why am I raising this example? I think it's to the great embarrassment of the Chinese that as soon as you're looking into their ancient texts, you're looking at human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, incredibly barbaric Stone Age beliefs, very often preserved, written onto the carapace of a tortoise, written on turtle shell and other ox bones, other types of bones, what have you, that record exactly what these rituals were. Yes, they included human sacrifice. I have read ancient Chinese texts that described a judge who couldn't decide which of two men was guilty of a crime. Like he heard the case, and he decided that he would sacrifice a goat on an altar to the ancestral spirits to decide which of the two men was guilty of the crime. And so, he performs this sacrifice where he stabs the goat, And the goat, which is dying and has only a few moments to live, it lashes out at one of the two men who are there on trial. So I don't know what to say. It was something like it was a murder, and one of these two guys had done it. And the goat, with its last strength, lashing out at these humans who have tormented and killed it, it manages to manages to gore one man and not the other. And the judge is completely says, "Oh, that's it. The spirits have spoken." I don't know if we could say the gods have spoken, but this is divine proof. You're innocent. You're guilty. Case closed. So, I'm raising this to speak to both questions. What is justice and what is government? All right. These notions emerged out of truly primitive forms of magical thinking in different cultures around the world. And it's interesting to note we didn't put much thought into overturning and transforming these notions from one epoch to the next. I'd say that the sense of justice we have today, it's very hard to pin down a precise beginning or ending to it. When did we start thinking of justice in the way that we do now? So I've already hinted at the problem, partly being attributable to Plato. Okay. The first principle of government is not justice. What is it that distinguishes government, a legitimate government, a real government, from a group of gangsters, a group of pirates who have to, in a sense, set down the law, at least for the men living within their own camp? As I said, often enough in history, you have a group of bandits, a group of pirates, however you want to put it, who end up ruling an island, who end up ruling several cities even, who become a de facto government for an area. But before you even get to that critical mass where pirates become kings, this has even happened in the history of England, by the way, just mentioning. In case you didn't think England was an island, it's happened in England, it's happened in Taiwan, it's happened throughout the Mediterranean, it's happened basically everywhere we have recorded history, we have written history, we have episodes like this, where what begins as piracy ends as a formal government. Before you even get to this critical mass of ruling over a city or an island or what have you, the pirate king has to set down the rules that are going to regulate his fellow pirates. Okay, so they kill people, but they kill some people, not others. They take hostages. They hold hostages for ransom. How is that ransom money divided? Right? They plunder, and there are spoils. How is the plunder divided amongst? There were a lot of potential misunderstandings that can end in a duel to the death. It can decimate your workforce pretty quickly. So yeah, to live outside the law, you must be honest. As soon as you're living outside the law in a situation like that, you'd be amazed how quickly rules and regulations proliferate. How quickly anarchy descends into despotism. That there's someone in charge of these pirates and he starts governing. Okay, what is the difference between a gang of bandits and a legitimate government? The answer is taxation. From a nihilistic perspective, the one and only criterion that differentiates a real government from a group of pirates is taxation. Right? Anyone can do justice. Anyone can know justice. I'm going to come back to that issue, the knowability of justice. Is justice a dogma? Is justice a doctrine? Is justice a kind of religious belief? Something supernatural and ineffable? Is it something knowable or unknowable? And indeed, cases like the death of George Floyd, cases like this most recent death of a man beaten to death by the police. I'm sorry, I won't lose my place here. But there was a very interesting example I heard on YouTube just in the last few days. I heard the account of a girl, well, she's now a fully grown woman. When she was 14, a man attempted to rape her. And I believe this was in a car. Now, attempted is important here. she was clever and she managed to manipulate him verbally and then escape and run away. So exactly what she said to him, I don't know, but she made up some reason. Oh, here, just one moment. I'll be back in just a sec, kind of thing. And then the minute she had the door open, she ran. But it was a very serious attempted rape of a 14-year-old girl, but she did escape. Now, she told her father immediately. I mean, within an hour or something, she told her father. And her father was not the kind of guy to go to the police. So again, this is a question. What is justice? How do we know justice? Who can know justice? Who does justice? Right? And the state, the government has no monopoly on these things. So reportedly, his father had a debate with some of his fellow gangsters, and they decided that because this was an attempted rape as opposed to an actual rape, they wouldn't kill him, but they would very seriously beat and torture him. They'd sort of beat him within an inch of his life and really engage in gruesome acts of torture against the guy. And apparently this was really debated philosophically, like, well, is it better to set an example where he'll now live for the rest of his life with the memory of this and kind of tell others the consequences of his actions? Or is it better, because if they kill him, then it's just silent. Like no one will ever hear why he died. He'll just disappear. So they decided not to kill him, but just to very seriously beat and torture him. So there's a plot twist coming up. Several days later, I forget if it was a week later or 2 weeks later or just 4 days later, I forget, but several days later, they changed their mind. They decided they really weren't at peace with it, that they didn't feel right merely beating and torturing him, and that now a couple days had gone by where he could have told other people what happened, or it could be known by more people, and they went and killed him. So they did kill him, after all, after beating him up and torturing him, and then he had some number of days to recover from being beaten and tortured. And there are many aspects of this example that are fascinating, but one is the girl who was 14 at the time and is now, she's a middle-aged woman now. She said that she herself felt that this was an injustice. Like she did feel that he should have been punished, but she felt that it was excessive to murder him in these precise circumstances, being exactly what they were. And she lived through it. She was herself tormented by a sense of guilt that this wasn't justice, but was instead injustice. Now, I've mentioned this before on the channel a long, long time ago. When I was a teenager, two very different women who were the same age as me, were all teenagers at the same time. It is with the school system. You tend to be friends with people who are the same age as you, or just 1 year older. Oh, yeah, that's right. One of these girls was, I think, 2 years older than me. Anyway, there were two different girls who told me rather dubious stories about being victims of rape. I'll say why they were dubious in just a moment. And here I was, this young man, very much raised by Batman, very much raised by the idea that, as I say, anyone can go out and do justice. What can I tell you? It's like baking bread. You can be a professional with a big factory that bakes bread. You can be a hobbyist and make bread with your own hands in your own kitchen. You can make justice with your own two hands. You don't have to go to an expert. You don't have to go to a scientist. You don't have to go to a government department. You don't have to hire a lawyer. Anyone can make bread. Anyone can make justice. And also anyone can make terrible bread, by the way. doesn't mean your loaf of bread is going to turn out well. Anyway, in both cases, at first, at least, I was really considering, well, should I get out and beat this guy up, or should I actually kill this guy? Like, what's the appropriate thing to do? And the two women were very different, and their stories were very, very different. Like they both were stories of rape, but they're two totally different stories. Just to put that out there. I'm not going to tell the two stories. It'd be long and disturbing topic for a video. I remember it all as like it were yesterday. Let me tell you, it's unforgettable. I'll tell you something these two women had in common. They were both trying to fuck me. All right. Now, I am not saying they were really consciously manipulating me and lying to me. But in both cases, these were women I knew for a long enough period of time. I knew them closely enough and intimately enough. And, as I say, there was this very strange, like component where they were trying to seduce me to some extent. They're trying to manipulate. They're trying to create some kind of, sexual relationship with me. And they're telling me this story as a part of it. And in both cases, ultimately, I had to conclude that this person really was an unreliable narrator. They're two very different women, and they're different for different reasons, you know. So anyway, I went through that process, and it shook me to my core. It shook me to my core because I was young and stupid, and my core was Batman. Okay, my notion of justice came out of Batman. All right. And for some of you, your notion of justice came out of cop movies, came out of Police Academy, came out of whatever. Some of you grew up watching different things on television, different movies. But I am sure up to a certain age, up to a certain stage in life, you never really seriously reflected on, okay, what is justice? How do we know what justice is? How do we do justice? How do we mete out? How do we measure out justice? And some of you watching this video right now will be the first time you reflected on it seriously. It may be that later today you have to reflect on the extent to which your notion of justice comes from Batman or some other cultural source just as stupid. But up to that point, even though I was reading some philosophy and I was interested in politics as a teenager, that was the period of time when I was still very interested in theater and being an artist, being an actor, I wasn't really being an actor. I was interested in being a playwright director, but I could also act, and I understood acting was, you had to master acting yourself to be a director and playwright and so on. So I was acting, I was involved in theater. I was interested in doing politics and philosophy on stage in the theater. You could make the argument that that's what I'm doing with you guys right now. It's just with a very modest cast of characters and very few special effects, very few props. We have Socrates in the background there. We have a Socrates puppet. If I actually want to use a prop, I could get Socrates up here and we can debate what is justice, just like Plato. Yeah, I had to reflect on, in the case of both of these women, the extent to which, with no other source of information, like without hearing the man's side of the story, without hearing anyone else, just listening closely to the same woman, over several days, and really seeing, wow, okay, like I really don't know what happened. And on the contrary, I have really strong indications that this woman is to some extent lying to me, to some extent lying to herself. There's a mix of fable and reality here, One of those two women, so I thought about this a lot. And how honest am I going to be here? One of those two women, I remember, after I'd kind of gone through this process of reflecting on it and realizing, like, I don't know what's real and what's false, but I'm certain she's lying to me about this, this, and this. Like within the narrative from day to day, you could see different things that were lies or deception. And, again, does she even know why she's lying to me? And this is again, I don't even know what age these people would have been. But like with the one that was 2 years older than me. So what? I'm 17 and she's 19. We're all very immature people, right? So I remember admitting to a mutual friend of someone who was a friend of hers and a friend of mine. That I had been told this story, and I've been told it repeatedly by her, but I had misgivings. So this female friend, a friend of both of us, she says right away, she was there and she talked to this female friend of mine the night it happened and the next day. And she then gave me this totally different version of events from the perspective of someone who's an impartial witness or a fairly impartial witness. And I remember hearing that at that stage when it already really molded over, and then, wow, okay, I was skeptical for a reason. This was this was an education in justice. I will never forget. And what did it teach me? Okay, I began the video by alluding to my competition, this other YouTube channel, Unnatural Vegan. Her great conclusion, she studied philosophy in university. Her great conclusion is that justice is unreal. Justice is real. Justice is not any less real than an abstract concept like beauty or an abstract numeral like the number 7, so on and so forth. It's real. The problem is it is not affirmable. You cannot affirm that you know it, neither in advance of doing justice, nor when you do it, nor afterward. It remains in perpetual contention. The death of George Floyd. The law is one thing, justice is another. Everyone in America, still to this day, says that it is a fact that the police officer placed his knee on George Floyd's neck. It was established in court that that is not true. And very simply, it's established because there's videotape footage from more than one angle. From one angle, it's kind of an optical illusion. If you're not looking carefully, it appears that the police officer's knee is on George Floyd's neck. If you're looking carefully, you can tell it's not really on his neck. From the other angle, it's clear that the police officer was following police procedure, and it may be a completely immoral, completely insane procedure, but this is the procedure he was following. And he had his knee placed on the flat part of the upper back of George Floyd. Now, it was established in court as a fact that George Floyd had used such a high level of drugs, the amount of drugs, I'm saying this poorly, the level of intoxication, the quantity of drugs in his blood circulation was so extreme that if he had been lying on the couch at home and he had not been accosted by police officers, he would have died. Right? He would have died if no police officer had arrested him, if no police officer had mistreated him and placed him on the ground and put their knee on his back. That was how high his level of intoxication. This was established as a scientific fact in court. Now, that scientific fact is irrelevant to the culpability of the police officers, and I'll state two reasons very quickly. One, the American so-called soft skull doctrine, right? Soft skull doctrine, somewhat disturbing term. That is the term used in American law. It doesn't matter how enfeebled you are. Like if the police run up and arrest you roughly, and it turns out you have a medical condition that makes you enfeebled, the police lay hands on you and they treat you the way they've treated 10 other suspects in the past, and none of them were harmed by being kind of grabbed and roughed up this way. But you happen to be a very sickly person. They don't know that. They kill you with the same use of force a healthy person would be able to endure. In the United States of America, under American law, the police are just as guilty. It doesn't matter. The point is, under American law, you cannot be blamed for your illness. You cannot be blamed for your infirmity. That's why it's called soft skull doctrine. Some people actually have a condition with their skull. You can imagine where relatively soft, relatively minor use of force is fatal for them or seriously injures them, whereas a normal person would be able to endure some knocks and blows above the head. Whether or not that is literally because you have a soft skull or it's some other medical condition, that you can imagine. So that's a legal doctrine in the United States of America that makes these facts irrelevant. Now, I'll tell you a moral consideration. that will seem more relevant to you. It may not be more relevant in the courts of law. The police knew the police knew that George Floyd was more or less overdosing on drugs, that he was on a very, very, very large quantity of drugs. It was probably self-evident to them that he had drugs on his person and he had swallowed them up when the police approached, because he didn't want to be caught in possession of the drugs, so that he had taken more drugs than he otherwise would have as the police were approaching him. That he had white powder on his lips and nose at the time, and that he was in an extremely intoxicated state. So, therefore, it is morally incumbent upon the police to put him in an ambulance and send him to a hospital, right? It is an absolute obligation. It doesn't matter what crime George Floyd is suspected of or guilty of. In this case, it was using a fake dollar bill, a counterfeit dollar bill. Okay, but even if he's guilty of 10 other crimes, he's wanted for 10 other crimes, at this moment, he's dying of a drug overdose. Your responsibility as a police officer, even if you handcuff him and put him in the ambulance, your responsibility is to send him to the hospital to save his life. Right? It's a life and death problem you're witnessing right then and there. So say this has more salience. Right? Nevertheless, justice. What you thought you knew about George Floyd 5 minutes ago, right? For many of you in the audience, but perhaps for all of you, now you view it differently. Everyone, I think, who saw the videotape, the security tape footage taken inside the grocery store prior to George Floyd's death, I think that changed everyone's perspective on who George Floyd was, what he was doing in the hours leading up to his death. All right. So now this is a situation where you have videotape evidence. Nevertheless, you have more than one piece of videotape to contrast. What you know changes how you feel. And now you're making inferences about justice. I am not saying that justice is ineffable, that justice is unknowable. You can know what is justice. You can do justice, but you can never be certain of it. It's not affirmable. You cannot know that you know it. So you can know it, but you won't be able to distinguish when you know it from when you don't. Many of you, a few months ago or a few years ago, you felt you knew exactly what justice would be in George Floyd's case. Then you learn some of the details of the case, and your perspective starts to change, and you start to ask more difficult questions about what is justice. All right. Again, if you spot the pattern, you can stop rushing to justice. You can stop having snap judgments about justice. And Plato has burdened us. Okay, should I blame Plato? All right. Well, I said earlier I wasn't going to blame Plato for this. Plato is in a position to be blamed. Our Western European tradition presents justice as the work of government, right? That justice is what the government does. Justice is what the government makes. And we imagine that in being citizens in the society, in sharing one polity together and being members of one democracy, or us all being ruled by the same king, sharing in one sovereign unit, that what we have agreed to is to have that king or his law or that parliament and the parliament's law decide for us what is justice and what is injustice. Now, there are many ways in which we all know this is just kind of flagrantly untrue. And government itself is very little interested in justice. And our interactions with the government have very little to do with justice. Now, as you know, I am not saying that any other culture's traditional view of government is superior to our own. it's somewhat ridiculous that the Chinese notion of government is based on rite and ritual, right? Spelled R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T. That it's based on, who performs these ceremonies and the fact that they perform them correctly. But that has everything to do with the question of who is, in fact, the emperor, as opposed to who is just the head of a gang of bandits, who is just a usurper, who is just a thug with an army who happens to take over the capital city in a civil war or in a coup d'etat, which, in case you didn't know, is something that happened again and again and again in history of China. Your legitimacy has everything to do with these magical rituals, with the relationship between heaven and earth, with the relationship between deceased ancestors and people who are living today. And sorry, just to mention this briefly, I think it is a very good symbol of how supernatural the Chinese view of government is. One of the rituals called the ritual of the golden bell. All these things probably can be translated many different ways. So sorry, maybe golden bell is a translation from the 1880s, and there's a better way to translate this to the golden measure or something. I don't know. But theoretically, the emperor would walk out into a field and would cut lengths of bamboo with a machete. And then these lengths of bamboo would be used to define the different notes in the musical scale. So like for us, what's the difference between C and C sharp? What's the difference when you say do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do? This definition of how music sounds, this is like redefining the laws of physics. The first duty of an emperor, when he first assumes office, is to go out. This would be like, again, in a sense, it's more mystical than just redefining how much is a kilogram, how much is a pound, right? Like how much is a weight of measure. No, we're supposedly going to redefine how every flute is tuned throughout the Chinese Empire, how every lyre, how every violin, violin is not a Chinese instrument, but you know what I mean? Every string instrument, how it's tuned, how it sounds, is supposedly going to be changed because all legitimacy, flows out from the emperor in this central ritual position where he stands at, the earthen altar, I want to say, the altar of earth and grain. Oh, geez, I'm forgetting now what that altar is called. Anyway, yeah, there's one particular magical altar that matters more than the rest in Beijing. Anyway, oh well, I'm getting old. Obviously, I'm not here to say to you that this ritualistic, magical view of government is superior to this view that, as I said, we can blame Plato for, although it doesn't really begin or end with Plato. This view that what government is centrally and definitively about is the doing of justice. Both are magical ways of thinking. Right? Now, it's always easier to see through these illusions when you just put a human face on it. Do you think Donald Trump knows the difference between justice and injustice better than you do? Really, really think about that seriously for a minute. If we had a system of government that was really about justice, we would all have tremendous respect for presidents, prime ministers, and governors precisely because of their views on justice. We would interview them about justice. We would ask them their opinions about justice, and we don't. On the contrary, the American tradition made explicit something that was implicit already in British politics, I think throughout Western European politics. We have this idea of, the separation, not only the separation of church and state, but the separation of the executive power of government from the judiciary. We actually have the view that doing justice should be separated from the authority of the king as much as possible, should be separated from the purview of Parliament as much as possible, that Congress should have nothing to do with the decisions made in the courts, that they should have nothing to do with the conduct of the police. Now, hilariously, this principle is violated all the time. Decades ago, I could have alluded to this as an historical event that everyone in the audience knows, but I think today it's very much ceased to be topical. People cease to think about it. If you look at the political show trials persecuting communists in the United States of America, right? Those were trials carried out by members of Congress and the Senate, right? Now, this is normally referred to as the McCarthy period of American government, or McCarthyism, McCarthyite, these things we use. McCarthy himself was an alcoholic, and what he had to say about communism hasn't aged well. He was really an incoherent alcoholic mess, and his name has become emblematic of this. He died not long after his brief period of fame. Okay, well, I asked one of my professors about this once. This was way back when I was in university. I said, what was the justification for having trials located in the Democratic branch of government? The whole theory of American government, going back to the Revolution and the Constitution and so on, was that you were supposed to separate these things. Now, by the way, sorry, I already said earlier, this becomes very explicitly articulated in American politics, but this idea already existed before the American Revolution in England. It certainly existed already in France before the Revolution. I mean that, not just after the French Revolution, but before. I don't know. A great contrasting example would be the history of Spain. You get in the history of the Danish and the Dutch and the Germans. How widespread was this notion? Well, I'll tell you, everyone could see the problem when the king descended into the courts and directly played favorites. When the king directly said, this person is above the law because he's a friend of mine. And that happened. So it's not surprising that there really was a broad discourse about this. I'll give you a funny example out of the history of France. All right, sorry, I guess this video can't go on forever. Prior to the French Revolution, the King of France would actually intervene in local politics and local courts. And this time, court is aristocratic. This is a court, both in our modern sense, like it's resolving some kind of legal issue, but also in a more medieval sense of being a group of aristocrats who come together to debate what should be done. They had this tradition where if the king came to intervene, he would sit in silence on the bed of justice. So pardon my French, but this is le lit du justice. Right? So I know it's surreal. I mean, it's just as ridiculous as what we were talking about with ancient China before. What is justice? Justice is a bed the king sits on. Obviously, it's not a bed in our sense exactly, but it's a special type of furniture. Anyway, what type of furniture exactly was the bed of justice? But it wasn't a bed to sleep on. It was a bed to recline on. The notion that the king would come and sit silently, and disapprovingly while forcing ahead the resolution of this issue in the local court. Still, on a very deep level, there's the notion that he shouldn't be intervening and just saying, this guy is above the law because he's a friend of mine, and this guy should be persecuted or prosecuted because he's an enemy of mine, or just based on the king's personal whimsy, right? So I do think, ultimately, the Western European idea of justice and the relationship between the court of law and the executive branch, if you like, the executive and deliberative branches and all the other aspects of government, ultimately it goes back to the Old Testament. Ultimately, this comes back to the Ark of the Covenant, right? The idea of the empty throne on top of the Ark, on top of the law, and the silence of God and the absence of a ruler, and the ultimately Mosaic model of government inherited from Moses. It's difficult to exaggerate how influential the Bible was in Europe, but I would point out that idea of how government works and how the courts work, it's utterly alien from the perspective of Athens, from the perspective of Rome. We're talking about pagan Athens, pagan Rome. Their idea of what government is nothing like, pre-revolutionary France, pre-revolutionary England. And then to say all these things become much more explicit once you have the American Revolution and the French Revolution, these implicit government. So you can really say this is a part of the Judeo-Christian period of our history, and it's radically incompatible with the notion of justice you see in Cicero in ancient Rome, or Thucydides, or any source you want to name, Thucydides and Herodotus, so on and so forth in ancient Athens. I'd also point out they utterly lack our notion of separation of church and state. I was reminded of this recently for unrelated reasons, but I think it's worth mentioning here. Today, we think of Julius Caesar as a military leader. We think of Julius Caesar as a despot, as a tyrant, who made the transition from being a purely military figure, a commander of an army, to taking over the government by brute force. Why would you suppose that's how the people of Rome perceived him? When he started minting his own coins, right, which reportedly he did without the permission of the Senate. So to some extent, in rebellion against the Senate, I do not know the details surrounding the minting of these coins. When he starts minting these coins that mysteriously have an elephant on one side, and I do mean that, I think the mystery of why the elephant is chosen as a symbol, I don't think that has been resolved. A lot of people on the internet will say there's no mystery at all. We've solved the mystery. I think it is still fair to say it's mysterious. He prints these coins that have an elephant on one side, but on the other side, there's purely religious iconography, reminding the people of Rome that he is their pontiff, word we still use to refer to the Pope. He had the highest religious office in Rome. He was a holy man who performed sacred rituals in Rome, and that is how the masses in Rome literally saw him. Like, it's just in terms of occasions where they would lay eyes on him, they had seen him performing these rituals again and again, acting as the supreme pontiff, the highest pontiff in Rome. Okay, so he was in their very complex, religious calendar. I mean, I've seen this calculated for Athens. How many ceremonies per year were there in Athens, right? I've never seen that for Rome. How many days of the year was there a sacrifice or a religious ceremony on? It's probably 300 days a year or something in Rome. Whether it was 250 days, there were a lot of these ceremonies. And Julius Caesar, part of the reason why he was known and perhaps loved by the people of Rome was that he had been in the position of being this important religious leader. They did not see any contradiction. Could be a holy man who performs these sacrifices, who performs these rituals, and you could lead an army and go and conquer and enslave and kill people. That's the ancient Roman perspective on life. That's their perspective on politics. That's their perspective, right, on government. So this idea of, it's a twofold separation of church and state, but separation of the courts, separation of the doing of justice from politics. Nobody examines this. We talk about a political decision as being something antithetical to a decision made on the basis of principle. Talk about the doing of politics and the doing of justice as if they need to be separated from one another, right? That was not Cicero's worldview, right? That's not the world Cicero or Socrates lived in, neither ancient Rome nor ancient Greece. They didn't see it that way at all, right? And, a young man who was ambitious to be a political leader might well pursue political leadership through a religious office, just as well as through the army, or both simultaneously, right? So they didn't see any conflict of interest here, so to speak. And again, Caesar, he got to choose what was on this coin. He could have anything on this coin, including he could represent himself as a military commander receiving a laurel from the goddess Nike. That would have been normal. It would have been normal for him to imitate an earlier dictator like Sulla and depict himself being celebrated for his military victories by the gods, plural, or by just one god, the goddess Nike. That would have been a normal thing to do, right? He could have just had his own face on the coin. Could have done all kinds of things. He chose to have the elephant on one side of the coin, and you turn it over, and there's a reminder that he is the pontiff, that he is the highest religious office in the land. Okay, so I just say it's a very, very long, strange path with, the Western European embrace of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, both, of course. But, it's easy to forget just how much political instruction is packed into the Old Testament. The Old Testament tells you a lot about law and justice and kingdoms and kingship. There's a lot in there. Who is a king and who is a tyrant? What does it mean to be a judge over men? There's a lot of material on that in the Old Testament. From my perspective, all of it bad. I've no sympathy for the Old Testament as a political doctrine or document, right? But this is massively influential and is part of, the loss of both the wisdom and the folly of ancient pagan Europe, the more democratic period of our history. Then we go into the Dark Ages. And there are a lot of these unquestioned assumptions about what is justice, right? And who gets to do justice as we head into the period of the French Revolution in Europe and the American Revolution and the New World, which basically creates the modern world order, both within nation states and geopolitically, in the relations between nation states. Now, I would point out it is in precisely this same period that the right to have a duel is first questioned. Yes? So, now I'll just say, generally speaking, all of the questions that get answered in the period of the French Revolution and Napoleon, all of those questions are already being asked in the 50 years leading up to the revolution. Put it that way, broadly speaking. Whether or not they've been answered, I think there's even an argument that the deeper philosophizing about these questions took place prior to the revolution, not after. Quite a few participants in the American Revolution say that, but on a shorter timeline. They say, the revolution really happened in 15 years before, the official start of the revolution. There's sort of 15 years where if you read the newspapers, you can see all these questions are being asked. Now, I would say it's much more than 15 years. But in any case, I get their point. These questions, they may seem to be answered suddenly when the moment of violence comes and when one social order is torn down and another created in its place. But all of these things were being philosophized about and questioned for many years, leading up to the relatively brief period of violence when, as I say, one social order replaces another. Okay, so in France, who ends the duel? Cardinal Richelieu. Right? The duel is tremendous symbolic significance. For our ancestors, for untold centuries, if you ask the question, what does it mean to do justice? The symbol of justice was two men fighting a duel. And it could indeed be a situation very much like the one I described. It was a case just from a few decades ago. This 14-year-old girl, she escaped from a man who attempted to rape her, and then her father decided to murder the man rather than going to the police, so on and so forth. So with all these questions of justice and injustice being rolled into it. Well, you know, in pre-modern Europe, in Europe before the French Revolution, in America before the American Revolution, there's no question a scenario like that. What do you mean police? The police don't exist. The concept of the police does not exist. The concept they have is of officers of the peace. Significant difference. There's no professional police force. There are officers of the peace. There are military officers in peacetime. There's no police force. A 14-year-old girl like that in the pre-modern world, she might well go to her brother. She might well go to her father, who would then fight a duel saying, "Sir, you have dishonored my sister. You have dishonored my family." Right? Cardinal Richelieu, I mean, he's ahead of his time, right? He's really heralding the beginning of modernity, right? This is the beginning of the notion that the state exclusively can do justice, that the state has this monopoly on the use of violence, right? Cardinal Richelieu abolishes the duel. Never again will two aristocrats decide who is wrong and who is right. Never again will two aristocrats resolve an injustice by killing each other in a duel. Imagine the shockwaves throughout the whole of society. And, I know this is going to sound ridiculous. Imagine how different our own culture would be. You can't have Batman in a society with these beliefs, right? If you actually live in a society where anyone can avenge any injustice, imagine how much different our culture of going to the gym would be. If we actually had a society where all able-bodied men were trying to maintain their physical strength and prowess with arms so that they can at any time resolve a dispute of this sort, and everything would be different. And, above all else, living in a society in which there are no police, there are merely men with swords, men with guns. There are people who are armed and there are people who are disarmed, And, those, by the way, in that society, those men with swords might drag you to the inns of justice. When was the last time you saw that in writing? The use of inn, I-N-N, as a place where the justice of a case is disputed. They might not kill you on the spot. They might take you to have some adjudication at a court, but they might not. Oh, and let me just add, in case you think it's only the Chinese who believe in surreal, magical thinking about justice and injustice, throughout this whole period of history, well, what if the court decided that this duel you fought was not entirely fair? Because if it was a fair duel, it's not murder. You're not guilty of any wrong. If you're brought in to court and they decide it is murder, maybe, for example, maybe you challenged a man to a duel, but he didn't accept. He was whimpering and cowardly, and you went ahead and killed him anyway. It wasn't a fair duel. He didn't stand and fight. These things happen. If you are taken into court and you are judged to be guilty of murder, you are guaranteed that you can get away with that murder as long as you are literate. Okay? This is so unbelievable. I have mentioned this on my channel before, I think years ago. Look up the word neck verse in English. This really tells you something about the darkness of the Dark Ages. A neck verse was a verse that you read aloud to save your neck. You were allowed to get away with murder once in our European tradition. So if you were judged guilty of murder as a literate man, you would read a verse out of the Bible, and a priest or monk would stand there next to you, watching you as you read it, and he would declare you legit. We still use the word legit this way, right? You would be declared legit. The meaning of legit is he reads. Okay? So you were declared legit in court, and you were given a tattoo on your hand, and thus you were allowed to get away with murder. That's our European notion of justice. That's our Western European. In case you think our tradition is very rational in contrast to the Chinese tradition or some tribal tradition, it's wildly irrational. It's all based on magical thinking. So, the origins of modern political science are ancient and unscientific. One of the conflicts I had with one of my professors, this was Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo. If you guys want to, you can Google him. I have a certain fondness for Ramin, but I think he's a complete idiot. Anyway, when I was a boy, really, I was a boy. I was talking to Ramin Jahanbegloo, and we had this one conversation in which I said to him, I'm studying political science and not philosophy, for example, because, I really do believe in political science as a science. Like, I think we can approach politics scientifically. And at that time, I remember my phrasing. I said, I don't agree with this postmodern tendency towards relativizing everything, treating everything as relative rather than absolute. I don't agree with this postmodern tendency of treating everything as being about subjective feelings and emotions, like you feel oppressed, this kind of thing. I really believe in an approach to politics that is, in this sense, scientific. So I believe in political science, put it that way, rather than philosophy as my subject. So Ramin was educated in Paris, and he reacted to this so viscerally, so dramatically, that it was kind of the end of the conversation. I came back and discussed it with him again a week later or 2 weeks later, I forget. But on that day, I didn't get another word in. I was kind of suffocated by his reaction. He very dramatically started denouncing me, claiming that I must believe in the doctrine of Auguste Comte. And then he starts attacking Comtean positivism. Okay. You guys can look up. I'm not going to encourage you to Google Auguste Comte and Comtean positivism, but I was totally unprepared for this reaction. To me, this was as bizarre as if I told someone I was addicted to video games, and they said in response, "Oh, you must play a lot of Vectrex," and then they start criticizing the Vectrex. It's like, of all the video games to be addicted to, why would you imagine it's Vectrex? I mean, geez, what an obscure, choice. I was really just flummoxed by this. It was so like, Auguste Comte positivism? What? Well, I couldn't imagine how he made this leap from what I was saying about political science as a real science to Comtean positivism. Anyway, we met again maybe 1 week later, maybe 2 weeks later, and I said, look, I want you to know, when I said what I said about political science being a real science, this is what I mean. Now, today I identify as a nihilist, specifically as an historical nihilist. Historical nihilism is my own school of thought, or it's a philosophy that begins with me. I hope it doesn't end with me. I hope all of you in the audience will take the philosophy of historical nihilism further, and each of you can take it in your own direction. Each of you can go on to become my harshest critic. I don't mind. But nevertheless, despite my nihilism, despite my much more mature perspective today, I think you can see even from this lecture, there is a sense in which I am a proponent of political science as opposed to political fable, political fiction. The basis of government is not justice. Government does not distinguish for us what is a justice and what is an injustice. Government does not even have any expertise in this area. In the same way that you can very quickly visualize who Donald Trump is, in Europe, you can visualize who Angela Merkel is, and you can admit to yourself, oh God, a great example, the current prime minister of France, Jesus Christ. This person does not know more than I do about justice and injustice. expertise. And indeed, as I say, it partly shows nobody even asks. Nobody is even interested in interviewing them about justice and injustice, like as broad philosophical concepts or in their particular application to political cases, particular cases. There's no sense of this. And on the contrary, I think most of these political leaders, if they're pushed into a corner by an interviewer, if they're really pressed on issues, say, look, I want to hear from you. Like in the case of George Floyd, what is justice and what is injustice? What they will claim in this tradition that became explicit with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, but was an implicit part of Western European culture before, they will claim, oh, no. That's for these minor bureaucrats to decide. I, in my lofty position as president, prime minister, or king, I have no opinion on the workings of the courts. What the courts do, I'm aloof and detached from. It's a totally surreal, totally ridiculous attitude. Now, let me just add, it's equally ridiculous for the president or prime minister to be aloof about what's happening in the military. Like what the soldiers are doing, like the quality of discipline and the morality of the soldiers and the efficacy of the military, that's your responsibility. You have to go down to the training camp. You have to go look at even like the quality of the soldiers' food and shelter. It's on you, homie. You have to go. You have to go and look at what's really happening in the military branch of government. You have to go evaluate it. You have to improve it. You have to pursue excellence in the military. Likewise, it's nobody else's job. You have to improve the quality of the police, the quality of the courts, the laws themselves. You're supposed to write and rewrite. It's ridiculous. Of course, it's your responsibility. And then last but not least, religion. Stop pretending that you are aloof from religion. I've seen Obama question on this. It's so embarrassing to hear Obama speak about religion. It's nobody else's responsibility but yours, homie. So just say, in opposing a scientific attitude to a kind of a fable, a largely unexamined set of cultural assumptions, some of which may be more magical than others. My fundamental answer is to say, look, justice is a simple concept. We have complicated it because, at least since Plato, probably since before Plato, we have wanted to pretend that justice is the definitive first principle of government itself. And the reality is, justice is something any of us can reason through for ourselves. It's something we can make with our own two hands. It's something we can figure out freely, looking at the facts of a case. We can figure out for ourselves what is justice and injustice, and our conclusions may be imperfect, but so too are Donald Trump's conclusions. So too are the conclusions of Judge Judy and Judge Ito, so on and so forth. Any judge on any case. These are deeply flawed, deeply biased people. They don't really know any better than you or I what justice is. Justice is indeed something like kneading your own loaf of bread. You can make your own justice in your own home. You may be able to bake a better loaf of bread by hand than the bread you can buy at a factory down the street, and you may not be able to. You may be a lousy cook. You may be a lousy baker. You make your own bread, and you think, wow, I wish I had bought the bread made by professionals down at the bakery. But nevertheless, justice is something we can reason through for ourselves in as much as anyone can know it. Nobody has any advantage over you in the knowing of justice, in the making of justice, in the doing of justice. Now, if we just state this principle in isolation, you might think I'm some kind of anarchist, and I'm not. I'm very much the opposite of an anarchist. From my sort of scientific perspective, what I consider to be scientific about my perspective on politics, what is the first principle of government? This is what I'm opposing to the fable, to the fiction, to the magical thinking. Yeah, sorry. Comment from Baltimore Retro Gaming. I'm a bigger and bigger percentage of my audience is brought here by my videos on retro gaming. I hope I can make more videos on retro video gaming. Frankly, I think most of my audience resents it. He's talking about the mayor of Baltimore. getting flustered by these questions. The current mayor of New York City, it's so embarrassing. Or the vegan mayor of New York City. Most of these guys, they are just not at an intellectual level equal to the responsibilities they have. It's now, Donald Trump also is not at an intellectual level to answer philosophical and political questions. But yeah, when you're looking at mayors and governors, it's scary. And if that is the intellectual caliber and the moral caliber of someone who becomes a mayor, how much worse are the police? So I already mentioned this, but Detroit has a fantastic history of corrupt, incompetent, stupid, and poorly educated mayors. So yeah, it's really something to reflect on seriously. And in the United States and Canada, mayors have a lot of power. A lot of the decisions that really matter, certainly about justice and injustice, who the police are and how the police operate, that kind of thing. A lot of them do come from the mayor. So whether or not that should be the case, that often really is the case. Okay. In what sense do I regard political science as science? Well, my view of government is that the first principle of government is taxation. Precisely what makes a government and not just a den of thieves, not just a gang of pirates, is taxation. Now, this is also an aspect of nihilism. Immediately, I can reverse course and criticize my own position and tell you the extent to which it is not true. Have there in the history of the world, have there been governments that were not built on taxation? The answer is yes. And it's very significant to note that the alternatives to taxation for how a government supports itself, right, on the one hand consist of plunder. I'll say a little bit more about that, right? And then on the other hand, consists of basically religious extraction of donations, tithes, so on and so forth. The extent to which taxation in Rome and Athens was voluntary versus involuntary, I think, is still debatable. I have read some modern scholars who try to claim that taxation was totally voluntary in those city-states. I think that is naive in the extreme. But the record of the textual record of like court cases and so on and how taxation is mentioned in them, I admit there's a dispute to be had there. To what extent were people donating taxes as opposed to actually having them collected like on a percentile basis or on some schedule for how much they should pay? I think that's a conversation still to be had. I just want to point this out. At the time of the American Revolution, the government of the United States of America went deeply, deeply into debt, right? Sorry, it's anachronistic to say the government of the United States of America. The rebel army that later became the government of the 13 colonies, right? The rebel army goes deeply, deeply into debt. This later becomes the United States of America. How are they going to get out of debt? Well, their first scheme was to conquer a whole bunch of land from the Native Americans, from the indigenous people, and then auction it off, and then collect that money and pay back the debts that had been accrued during the Revolution, right? So this is a form of plunder, right? So still today, the United States of America could look at a national park. Okay, Yosemite National Park. They have a big park. It's government-owned land. They could divide it up and sell the land, a kind of plunder, and that would bring some money into the government. Right now, for various reasons, that's not going to happen. Right, but yes, there have been periods of time, and there have been cultures in which taxation was not the main source of revenue for government, where governments really were much more piratical. They would go out and conquer and loot and steal and enslave from other governments, right? And then that would be the revenue for their own government, for their own army, so on and so forth. Right? That's basically the plundering model, which, so as I say, it includes plundering land, like where you conquer land and then sell it, but also just boats full of people, then you turn the people into slaves, so on and so forth. But whether it's directly looting valuable materials like gold, land, so on and so forth, or people or what have you. Where I was in Southeast Asia, elephants, where governments are conquering people to take away elephants, take away skilled labor and this kind of thing. In any case, there is a plunder-based model of government to be contrasted to taxation. And then the only other contrast worth talking about are situations in which there's something more like a magical or religious tithe, where people are donating money to the government. To what extent it's coercive, to what extent it really is based on magical and religious beliefs, another matter. Um, uh, in the Muslim tradition, they have zakat and so on, but where the religious nature of the collection of money masks the underlying reality of it being a kind of taxation. And case by case, those scenarios, sometimes they may really just be the same thing as taxation with a ritual layer of paint on top of it. But in some cases, they may be significantly different. It may not be as straightforward as taxation with a religious excuse for it. Okay. As soon as you have taxation, what do you have next? You have a permanent army. Okay. As soon as you have a permanent army, you have a permanent system of education. So that's the third principle of government. The people of Athens, as soon as they have taxation, they build walls. As soon as they have walls, they have teams of young men doing compulsory military service, guarding the walls, marching up and down along the walls. They have teams of young men doing compulsive military service, learning to work together as a crew on a boat in a time of war. Learning to work together on a wooden boat that is going to be lit on fire in a time of war. Everybody on that boat has to speak exactly the same language. Everyone has to respond to the same verbal command. One word gets shouted out, and everybody on the boat has to know to run to the right station, to do the right thing, whether that's to deal with fire, like the ship is on fire, or it's jumping over the edge of the boat to attack the enemy, whatever the case may be, right? My point is this. There is a kind of intense socialization that comes out of compulsory military service that transforms society and transforms the world, right? When you're looking at Athens, you are no longer looking at a tribal society. In many ways, it's a shockingly modern society. And you will notice they are intensely xenophobic. The people in the very next city state next door, they regard them as not speaking Greek at all. The Boeotians, this is the British pronunciation. I won't attempt the proper ancient Greek pronunciation, but like the very next city state next to Athens, those people just don't speak Greek at all. Like their accent is just terrible. We know that like they're 99% the same language. These very slight differences in language, they're incredibly disparaging to words. Well, in truly ancient societies, we're talking. I am referring to ancient Athens as relatively modern. In really tribal societies, right, you sustain very, very high levels of linguistic diversity, very, very high levels of religious diversity, right? But now, here we are living within the walls of Athens, where every young man serves in the military together, and every man grows old paying taxes to support that military. Like when you're too old for military service, you're still paying. You pay your whole life to support the same army that you formerly were a part of, and you probably felt proud to be a part of. Maybe not, maybe you felt ashamed of it, but we're everyone is speaking the same dialect because of that education they had in the army, and everyone is performing some of the same religious rituals together, right? Because of that armed service. Whether the education they receive is good or bad, the military itself is the world's first system of education. So that's government in principle. Taxation, military service, and education. I think I think there's a kind of phony tragedy for our generation because we are perpetually looking to government to give us justice, when the reality is government has nothing to do with justice at all. You know? Now, what if we set aside this word justice dripping with Platonic connotations, and just for one moment we talked about revenge? If your 14-year-old sister has been raped, there's been some tragedy, there's been some harm done to you, and what you want is revenge. Do you think the government, the police, the courts, or even the House of Parliament, do you think they can give you revenge? Do you think that's the business they're in? I've had all kinds of tragedies in my life. I've had all kinds of terrible things done to me by other people. Do you think I can go to the parliament here and give a speech? Cicero could have done this. I mean, back in ancient Rome, back in ancient Athens, this is what government was all about. Do you think I can get up and give a moving speech about how the corruption of the university system has ruined my life, and that then government is going to do something about it? Do you think I could go to parliament and give a moving speech about the corruption of the divorce system, the divorce court system, and how that's ruined my life, and then parliament is going to do something about it? If you want revenge, just like baking your own bread in your own kitchen, you're going to have to do it with your own two hands, or you're going to have to get involved with a bunch of gangsters, with the mafia, with some bandits, with some pirates, with some armed men who have no particular pretense to a monopoly on the use of force, who have no particular pretense to having an exclusive or superior knowledge of justice. People are reaching out for justice, but they are reaching out in the wrong direction. They're reaching in the wrong place. Government is not now, and never has been, about justice, about doing justice. It's not even interested in questions of justice. If you want justice, you have to make it yourself.